Excellent. In that case, hello, everybody. A very, very warm welcome to the first New Directions LATAM pre-conference webinar from quite a chilly UK. It's lovely to have you all with us. Just to say, the aim of the pre-conference webinars are really to start discussing the conference themes, to meet some of the presenters, and to begin conversations that we really want to continue in Sao Paulo in May. This is the first of 2 webinars. We'll have one next month as well. And we're very, very lucky to have 3 wonderful presenters with us today. But before I hand over to them, just a couple of housekeeping items. So this webinar will be recorded and everybody who attends will have access to it towards the end of next week by the time it's ready. If you would like a certificate of attendance for this webinar, please can you write to the email address that you can see on your screen there, newdirectionslatam@britishcouncil.org. And please write with the name that you'd like on the certificate, and we'll make sure that a certificate makes its way to you. There is a chat function, so please pose questions in the chat. The format of today's webinar is that our 3 presenters will talk for 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a Q&A all together at the end of the webinar. We'll try and get through as many questions as we can, but if we can't get through all of them, we'll try and make sure they get answered in one way or another. I can't seem to move on to my slide. Bear with me. I'm going to stop sharing a second. Sorry about that. I don't know why my slide would not move on. No. There we go. All right. So for those of you who don't know much about New Directions LATAM, it is an English language assessment conference. It will be from the 25th to the 27th of May in Sao Paulo. We will have 1 day of pre-conference workshops. There are 4 really exciting workshops that we've got advertised on the website, and you can join those as well when you register for the conference. The main conference is actually on the 26th and 27th of May, and the 3 presenters we have today are our plenary speakers. There'll obviously also be panel discussions and breakout sessions as well. Registration is open right now, so please join us if you can in Sao Paulo in May. It is an in-person conference. There isn't a hybrid element to it. 2 years ago, we had an online conference based out of Colombia, which was wonderful, and it was online because of COVID. So this is the first time in 4 years in LATAM we'll all be together under the New Directions banner, so really, really looking forward to it. I mentioned our presenters. They're going to be talking about different aspects of the themes around the conference. As I said, they're going to be talking for about 10 minutes each, and they're just going to give you a little taster of what to expect during the conference. And after that, we'll bring them back in plenary and you'll have a chance to ask any questions that you want to. So I am going to stop sharing now and say I think that's enough from me for now. And I'm going to hand over to our first presenter for this afternoon, and it's Professor Barry O'Sullivan, who is the Head of Assessment Research and Development at the British Council. Thank you for joining us, Barry. I know that you've been travelling and you're not 100% well, so really appreciate your time. Over to you.
Barry, you're on mute.
You are on mute. Can you unmute yourself? Oh, there you go. Gotcha.
Yes, no. Am I still sharing?
You are sharing. You're on slide 2.
Oh, God. That's supposed to be on slide 2. It's supposed to be on slide 1.
You're on slide 1 now.
And now I'm on slide 1, and I think I know where I'm going. Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to Friends, I've noticed on the list of people there from Azerbaijan, or Uzbekistan, I should say, sorry, Andre, to Sao Paulo itself. So it's great to see so many different people here, and I'm hoping to meet lots of you when I get back to Sao Paulo. I haven't been there for a few years now. So I'm going to talk very briefly about my own talk at the conference, which will be around reshaping education, aligning assessment with curriculum and delivery. And it'll come as no surprise to those of you who've heard me talk before that I will start with my triangle, my curriculum, delivery and assessment, which I call the comprehensive learning system. We all know, I hope by now, that if there are any breaks in the system, so if I have a problem with my curriculum, if it's not altogether clear, or if my assessment isn't clearly linked to the curriculum, or if my delivery, which delivery can be anything from the textbooks, it can be the teacher training, it can be the teacher selection, teacher professional development. Any missing cog in those wheels means that our system will not work. So that's the very first thing that I think we need to remember when we're talking about aligning any system. It doesn't matter what subject we're teaching. It doesn't matter what system. It doesn't matter what country. So even within Brazil, for example, it could be higher education, English, it could be junior high school. It could be any system within a context. Of course, none of this makes any sense unless it's focused on a specific context. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this because it's I've talked about it lots of times before, and if you want to hear more about it, just have to come to the conference in Sao Paulo. It's called the comprehensive learning system, and that's your first takeout, is a triangle. I'm basing this all around geometry, folks, so I hope you remember some of your very basic geometrical symbols. The next one we think about are standards. Now, the whole point about a standard is that it's got to be clear, it's got to be very systematic. If it's clear and systematic, it can drive the whole system. So every single thing that we talk about should be driven by a single set of standards. The standards, of course, are very good, but on their own, they're useless. They must be locally appropriate. We see so many instances of people who go to a conference and they think, oh, I really like that. I like that test, or I like that textbook, or I like those standards. And then they automatically bring it back to their own context and assume that it's going to work. Well, sorry, folks, it doesn't necessarily work. If you do your research and your homework, is basic homework, you may find that there's evidence that the standard developed in one context may work in your own. You know, that's great. I'm really happy when that happens. But the reality is that standards must be locally appropriate, and you must show they are. And when I mean locally appropriate, I really am talking about the learner or the test taker. The standards must be appropriate to the learner or test taker in all kinds of different ways. Now, we can talk more about that, obviously, when we have more time. But right now, I want you to get that into your head. That standards are standards and great, brilliant. They'll work, they'll run the whole show for us. But if they're not appropriate to the test taker, they're highly unlikely to work. Okay, so that's your second geometrical shape is a circle, and that reflects the standards that we use to drive the system. So how do we develop standards? Well, so many places I go to tell me, oh yeah, we have our standards, it's the CEFR. Well, I'm sorry, again, to disillusion people, but the CEFR is not a set of standards. It's a reference document. It's the Common European Framework of Reference for Language. The reference is the clue. Reference literally means that it's a piece of information that you go to when you're trying to create a standard or a test or a curriculum or anything else. You go to it for reference. You see which bits of it are likely to fit into my context, which bits of it may not definitely fit, or which may need some changes, some tweaking to fit into context. So again, we look to the CEFR to guide us, but it doesn't drive us. They're not the standard. They're just a reference. Again, the CEFR should be specified. It needs to be appropriate in a specific context. It needs to be localized. And when I talk about localized, what do I mean? Yet again, I mean the learner and the test taker. The learner and the test taker has got to be at the center of everything we do. So if it's localized, it means that it's fully appropriate for those learners within that particular context. So now the third piece of equipment we have to think about is that square. It doesn't look all that square to me actually, but it's supposed to be a square. And that is the localized CEFR. Remember, localized CEFR will work in your context. Non-localized CEFR may not. It might. If you have evidence to show that it will, great. But don't base the system on the CEFR. That's not what it's there for. Now, there are various ways we can link what we do to the CEFR, or we can use the CEFR to drive what we're making if we're making a new resource. Remember, that can be an assessment, it can be a textbook, it can be a syllabus, it can be anything we want. But the CEFR can help us, but it should not be driving it. It should not be the only thing that we look to. And it should not be used unless we are absolutely certain that we have taken the bits that are appropriate for this particular localized context and for this particular level of language, and etc. Again, we would need to think about these in a very systematic way. Therefore, if we're thinking, as my argument has always been, that the learners are at the center of everything, that's the whole philosophy of the socio-cognitive approach to test development and validation. It's the whole philosophy behind the comprehensive learning system. But if we're to ensure that this actually happens, it's no good just having theories. It's no good just having documents. We've got to make sure that we think about how those documents can actually be used in the real world. And for that, we need a policy. Now, I'm talking about an EDI policy here, because EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion, means that we're trying to involve all learners, all test takers in what we do in the same way. Excuse me. So we can see here that in the British Council, what we've done, thanks to the work of our colleague, Gemma Bellhouse, who's worked over the last number of years on creating a dual policy, one aimed at the administration of the test, which are related to what we know as accommodations. Most exam boards have one of these booklets or policies. But what we've tried to do over the last number of years, and what Emma has tried to do, or Gemma has tried to do over the last few years, is to look at embedding EDI, embedding these sort of things in our whole system. So this is related to the development of the test. So how do we ensure that the test is developed with EDI in mind? And that means with all of our candidates, all of our test takers in mind. We do that by having a dual policy. If we have that dual policy, we can ensure that the tests themselves are appropriate to our learners, fully appropriate, and the administration of those tests are equally appropriate to those learners. Now, as I said, that's a relatively new concept, I think. It's not something that we see talked about in language testing, but it's critically important. So if we're then to think about the system as a whole, we have to think about the four shapes that we talked about today: the comprehensive learning system, the standards that drive the comprehensive learning system, the localized CEFR that helps us to derive those standards and ensure that those standards are internationally relevant and are systematic in terms of the growth and development of language, and then the policies that allow us to ensure that those standards and the comprehensive learning system is delivered equally and fairly to all learners. Just to give you a little bit of time now to think about, and if you have your cameras to hand, you can think about the comprehensive learning system. That's a document that I produced myself a couple of years back. That's a QR code that will take you to the comprehensive learning system document, which you can download free from the British Council website. I'll give you another 4 seconds to get that done. And if you're interested in the EDI policies, you can scan both of those for access to those policies. And I'll give you a few more seconds before I finish talking. And again, if you need to see these later on, I'm sure we can get them to you. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Barry. I was busy making notes and I didn't realise you'd finished. I'm so sorry.
So you weren't listening to me?
No, I was listening. I was making notes. Right. So thank you very much, Barry. So things I took away from that: standards, localization, policies and shapes, geometric shapes. They've all got to work together and be aligned. I'm not going to say much more for now. I'm going to bring in our next presenter because we'll take questions later. Oh, somebody's just put, could we have access to those QR codes? Yes, you can. Definitely. We'll put those QR codes up again later. Don't worry at all. I'm now going to introduce our next presenter. We have the wonderful Dr. Evelina Galaxy, who's Director of English Research at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. Evelina, thank you so much for being with us. I'm just going to hand straight over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mina. I have to say, I always enjoy listening to Barry because even areas I've thought about quite a lot, he manages to give me a new thought. And that's always a good experience. And welcome to all of you. Just like Barry said, it is incredibly wonderful and heartwarming and humbling to see so many of you joining us from around the world. So thank you for giving us your time. Okay, so my topic is AI, technology, but in fact, it does link to what Barry was talking about because his triangle, which included curriculum, delivery, and assessment, is about the whole ecosystem of learning, and technology is a player in that. So this talk is, in fact, I encourage you to think of connections with what we've just heard about. Okay, so what AI can and cannot do for language learning and assessment. Now, AI is evolving as we speak. The models that AI has been using there are two kinds of models. One is called predictive models of artificial intelligence, and the other kind are generative models of artificial intelligence. Now, the predictive models are essentially models that can, for example, identify the photo of a dog. So they can predict what a dog looks like, and they can identify that from photos of, let's say, other animals. They can classify a learner's script. So this is in the context of language learning. So they can AI can read a script through machine learning, and it can classify it against a scale that it has been trained on. So that's a predictive model. However, the latest evolution of AI is in the generative model direction. So now we're talking about generative AI. And what this means is that whereas before machine learning and artificial intelligence could identify the photo of a dog, now it can actually create the image of a dog through being given instructions in text format. So I can give it instructions, it will create that image. Instead of classifying a learner's script against a scale, it can now actually write a learner's script. And it can do much, much, much more. So it can write poetry, it can write essays, it can solve maths problems, not all of them, of course, but it can solve some maths problems. It can give you recipes for things that you're looking for. So very, very powerful technology that we need to take into our orbit and understand better in terms of its impact on assessment and learning. There's some very, very big key players in this area. ChatGPT is probably the AI tool that you're most familiar with. This was released in November of last year. And it's basically a chatbot that you can give instructions to, questions to, and then it generates content. This is, I'm just giving you some statistics there from SimilarWeb. It reached 1 million users in 5 days. That is faster than other applications such as TikTok, for example. 100 million active monthly users. This is actually data from February, which might have increased. 13 million unique visitors per day. Very, very, very big, as you can see. Microsoft is behind it. It has invested made a multi-billion-dollar investment in OpenAI, which is the company. Other big players are Alphabet and Google. They have their own chatbot called Bard. Meta also, and the Facebook, the old Facebook, they're developing their own generative AI technology that is called Llama. Baidu and Alibaba, so these are big companies in China, are also experimenting in this area. So this is really very, very big. This is of the magnitude, I would say, as social media, the impact of social media on society and also education. That was the last true innovation from big technology. This, I think, is of the same scale. So should we be excited about these developments? There are many positives, and I'll just talk to you about a few of them clearly when we meet in Sao Paulo in Brazil in May, we'll explore these in much more detail. So here's some of the opportunities for education. The first one is content creation. You can create content whether that's assessment content or learning content, at speed, at scale, and at relatively low cost. You can also populate for assessment boards, you can populate item banks. So when you put tests together, especially as a big organization, you create your items, that's your content in banks, those banks include a lot of information about those items. You can actually populate item banks at a faster rate than having human beings create that content who are trained. You can also, through having more content, you can also be much more creative in terms of how much you can offer to learners and also test takers in terms of adaptive pathways for you to for adaptivity and personalization to be introduced in any learning content. You need a lot of, in any learning system or assessment system, you need a lot of content for those pathways to be populated. Another opportunity is that we can explore new constructs. For example, we can rethink the traditional and classical assignments we've been giving for writing, let's say, and we can use generative AI text to then build on that. So there's an opportunity to push us into exploring new constructs here, new evaluation criteria as well, in addition to the traditional ones we've been doing, because the task will change. Teacher's assistant, this is technology that can definitely assist in terms of what teachers can do in the classroom. And also creativity, just the sheer possibility to create new images, new text, new audio, new video beyond our imagination, but through the view of technology, is a very, very strong positive as well. So there are a lot of opportunities for education. But as often happens with big technology, the solution is also the problem. So should we be worried? And here just some of the ideas, some of the thoughts I want to share with you in terms of what we should be considering and exploring much more. Now, this technology is very powerful, as I said, but it can produce inaccurate content. This is called digital hallucination. So this is basically producing content which is not accurate. One example is Facebook had their own Galactica chatbot introduced last year. And after a few weeks of it being live, it started, the idea was for it to summarize research. And after a few weeks, it started producing fake research that it was building into its summary. So inaccurate content is a possibility. Also very biased and inappropriate content. So machines are only as intelligent as their training models are, and the training data, we all know that. So this can be from just embarrassing mishaps, which just sound funny, to very biased and inappropriate content, which can also happen. That's a very, very strong risk. Assessment malpractice is another possibility. If the machine can generate an essay for you, you could possibly use that as part of your coursework. Or you can, in fact, even if you're intent on cheating in a high-stakes environment, you can also submit it in an automated assessment context as well. Another risk and threat is that we could be narrowing down our construct. So what we can build into our tests could also be limited by what the technology can do. So there is that danger as well for us to be aware of, that it could narrow down what actually good assessment and good learning is. And one more, there's the issue of intellectual property, IP, and copyright. If the generative AI systems, they create content through pulling lots of others, through borrowing basically from the World Wide Web, which means that they're taking from other people's work. So these are just some thoughts and issues for you to be aware of. So at New Directions Brazil, and also through, I'm hoping, some pre-event blogs that I'll be producing, we'll explore these ideas together. We'll look at generative AI, Gen AI, we'll look at the opportunities and the dilemmas for assessment organizations, for teachers, for learners, for test takers, and for policymakers as well. So this is just a little burst of information from me. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Evelina. Very, very exciting. A little bit scary, if I'm honest, but that's on a personal level. And I'm a bit scared. I don't understand digital hallucinations, but they do sound a bit scary. But thank you so much. I want to just say, please pop to the participants, please pop your questions in the chat. I don't think you can raise hands and we can bring you on camera, but if you pop your questions in the chat, I'll bring your questions to the panel at the end of the session. Thanks again, Evelina, that was great. And now I'd like to hand over in a moment to our last presenter for this afternoon, Dr. Gladys Quevedo Camargo, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Foreign Languages and Translation at the University of Brasilia. It's wonderful to have you with us, Gladys. Thank you so much for joining us. Handing straight over to you.
Thank you very much, Nina. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here to be learning with Barry and Evelina. I'm just in awe with, everything they said. But, my topic is the role of assessment in the Brazilian education context and its potential washback effects. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on our reality in Brazil. I was inspired by the conference theme, Reshaping Education, Aligning Assessment and Curriculum and Delivery. And I was thinking about our new national core that started being implemented in Brazil in 2018. It's called the National Common Curricular Guidelines. And this is an official document that rules elementary and secondary education in Brazil. It established that English is a compulsory subject to be taught from the 6th grade onwards. And this is new because before that, English was just recommended and not a compulsory subject, right? One more novelty that this official document brought is one of the main axes that it brings is oracy. And this is a huge challenge in Brazil, of course, and in many, many countries in Latin America, because of the size of the classrooms, right? Of the groups of students that we have, especially in public schools. Well, Brazil doesn't have an official English language exam. Brazil doesn't have standards for English language, and it doesn't follow or has any adaptation of the CFR. So despite of that, we do have an English language component, and it's based on reading in this national secondary school exam. It's a 10 multiple choice question test, and it's inside this exam with all the other subjects, right? We also have another set of standardized tests that is called Basic Education Assessment System. It has existed for some time. It's applied in elementary education so far. It has been applied only for elementary education. And in the future, probably in the next edition or in 2 years' time, we're going to have this Basic Education Assessment System applied in the secondary education with English component, right? Well, but this new official document has a very good potential to cause washback effect on classroom assessment because the school curricula will have to align to it, right? But then what about the 2 national exams that we have? Well, what I want to discuss a bit further in my presentation in May is the role such exams have nowadays, the way they are, and may have in the future, considering the need of aligning assessment and curriculum with curriculum and delivery. So we can very much connect with what Barry said about the comprehensive learning system, right? So certain things should be considered by all these stakeholders. So first, exams are inserted in an economic, social, political, and educational context. So everybody knows that. So it's the same for classroom assessment. And the realities inside the country are very different. Brazil, for example, is a huge country, right? So second, the use made of tests and their results is extremely important due to the consequences or the impact, if you prefer, that they cause. So not only in high stakes exams, but also in classroom assessment. Well, third thing that we should think about is the impact of an exam and how it varies depending on who is involved, right? So we have different people, different ages, different places, different stakeholders. Fourth is the impact of an exam and the quality of this impact. It could be positive, it could be negative, it could be zero, depending on what is done, right? And also we have to remember that the analysis of the impact of an exam is a crucial element to its validation in the context in which it is inserted. And such analysis has to be carried out in a systematic way. We have to have studies and research on that. So the role that assessment plays in a society is very much connected with how much that society knows about the pros and cons of assessment. And here I'm talking about assessment literacy and how seriously assessment is taken by that society. So in order to reflect on the role that assessment plays or might play in an educational context, we could ask questions such as, what positive impact is the exam intended to have? For whom? And in what ways can this impact be identified? Also, how to ensure that the impact will, in fact, be beneficial to the stakeholders involved. Another question is how to ensure that the decisions made based on the results of the exam will be beneficial to each of the stakeholders. Also, what are the possible negative impacts of applying the exam, and what are the possible negative impacts of using the test results? And finally, we could also ask how to mitigate the possible negative impacts caused. So as you can see, there is a lot we should think about. There is a lot to study, and there's a lot to research, right? So it's something that especially the Brazilian society has to discuss, and the authorities have to think about and make actions to improve the current assessment system in Brazil. Now, if there is no alignment, it's unlikely that exams will play any role in improving language learning and will end up having a teaching to the test education, which is not always good. Well, I don't have much time, so I'd like to finish my short talk here, emphasizing the importance of having the New Directions LATAM conference in Brazil. So I think it's a great opportunity to draw people's attention to the importance of assessment in language education. And when I say people, I mean different stakeholders, teachers, researchers, school coordinators, educational authorities, all those who are decision makers. So it's very important that we think about assessment and how important it is in our society. So the second reason, I think it's a great opportunity to promote language assessment literacy at different levels in Latin America in general. And third, it's a wonderful opportunity to meet people face to face, to interact, to network, to talk about assessment, to exchange ideas, and so on and so forth. So the New Directions LATAM is a moment for, in my opinion, is a very special moment for us Latin Americans to think about our own context, our own education systems, our own stakeholders, and our own problems. And inspired by research carried out in different places in the world, find out our own solutions in order to find our ways in this complex situation that our assessments normally are. So in other words, it's a great opportunity to make global knowledge into local knowledge. And this is also related to what Barry said about the localized CFR, right? So I'm really excited about this conference. I'll be in this panel with Professor Evelina and Professor Barry. I will also be in a pre-conference workshop with my friends from La Alta, the Latin American Association for Language Testing and Assessment, Naibe Rosado from Colombia, and Liberato Santos from Brazil, and in a paper presentation with my friend Professor Juliana Tonelli from the University of Londrina. So thank you all very much for listening to me, and thank you again, Mina, for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Gladys. That was so eye-opening. Thank you for opening a little window into the Brazilian context for us and just giving a taste of kind of the challenges and possible opportunities I think there are in Brazil. And just to say on behalf of the British Council, we are very excited and very, very honoured to be coming to Brazil with New Directions. So we're very, very much looking forward to it. Okay, so we've had three lovely presentations by our presenters. There's Barry, I know, has been posting QR codes in the chat. Thank you very much, Barry. I'm now going to open the floor for questions. Barry, you did get a question in the chat about the development of local tests and you sort of answered it. Do you want to carry on? Do you want to take that, or do you think that's answered?
I do. I just say that we would normally start by having a localized version of the CEFR. And localized could be if you're working in a university or in a school and you're creating an assessment, you would go to the CEFR and you would identify the level, the aspects of assessment that you might look into, and identify the relevant scales, etc. And then, you know, you may find that you need to make some tweaks to it. The CEFR is not a holy object that cannot be touched. You work with it, you use it to work in your own context. Once you've done that, then you can start creating anything, curricula, assessments, materials, but you always start by defining your construct, and the CFR can help us to define the construct.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, Barry. Please pop your questions in the chat if you want to. I see quite a few comments, quite a few likes and hearts. We like hearts in LATAM, but not very many questions. So I'm going to jump in there and ask a question if that's all right. Generally going to ask, well, it's for any of you presenters really, but in terms of aligning curriculum delivery and assessment, where does one start? Where is a good starting point? I know, Barry, you mentioned it at the beginning of your presentation, but I just wondered whether Evelina or Gladys had any input on that. Because I'll be honest with you, we work with a lot of ministries, and there are some ministries where everything is kind of disjointed. So if we were to start, where would be a good place?
Gladys, can I leave it to you, because I can talk about it conceptually, but you of course have the more in the field experience.
I think that's the $1 million question to start from. Well, from what I can see, there are lots of things to be aligned, because, for example, in Brazil, we do have this national core. So it is an official document. And so as an official document, we have to follow that. So I don't know, but I guess that we would have to take a look at the exam and at the national core that we have and start aligning the exam to the national core, right? So that's just to talk about this standardized exam that we have, right? Why am I worried with this alignment? Because, you know, the exam is just focusing on reading. So if the national core focuses so much on oracy, that means that speaking would be part of, you know, a strong part of classroom teaching. And this is what teachers have been working on since this document was launched. So I know we cannot expect that the insertion of an exam into a system will cause positive effect all the time. We know that there are lots of studies and articles about that. But we also know that when the exam is well thought, well planned, and has the test taker, as Barry said, and the learner, you know, in the core, there is a very, very good chance of having positive impact. So when I don't test speaking, so probably, you know, teachers won't worry so much about working with speaking. So that's why I think it's, you know, that there is a complex connection here in this alignment, right? I think we have to step on two boats at the same time. I don't know if this answer is right, but that makes sense to me. I don't know.
Well, I think it's a real contextual answer. I don't think there is a right and wrong answer. And if there is, it is contextually based, in my opinion. Gladys, we have a follow-up question. It says, when you say national core, do you mean BNCC?
Yes, exactly. BNCC.
Yes.
I just didn't use the name in Portuguese, but that's the BNCC. It's in Portuguese, Base Nacional Comum Curricular. Exactly. And the other set of exams I mentioned, which is the basic education. In Brazil, we call it SAEB. So it's SAEB.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Can I step in?
Do.
I think it's so useful to hear Gladys out, you know, with experience, actual experience. For me, it's so important to focus on the role of assessment literacy, which was actually one of Gladys's points during her little teaser presentation, because that's when people start understanding the links, that triangle that Barry was talking about. And there's relatively low assessment literacy actually throughout. So that's really important. And it's really assessment literacy at all levels of decision making, including at the highest level, because that's where those big, most impactful decisions get made, but also at the grassroots level for the teachers, for the ones who are basically putting this into practice every day in their classrooms. So assessment literacy really, I think, is fundamental here.
Yeah, completely agree. Barry, did you want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, generally when I'm asked to go to a ministry to talk about what might or might not be done, The first wall I generally meet is an assessment literacy wall, followed by an ideological wall. So I can't do very much about the ideological wall, but I can start to chip away at the assessment literacy wall. And one of the reasons I always talk in very simplistic terms, in terms of triangles and circles and squares, is that often policymakers and influencers, particularly the policymakers, are not capable, to be absolutely honest, of following an academic argument. So it needs to be made quite simple for them.
Yeah, and they change every few years. There's a new one we need to educate.
Yes, and that's normal. So, and I think once people understand the necessity to align the different elements of the system, and once they begin to see it as a system and not as different individual elements, then you can start to make progress. Until then, it's not possible. People have this daft idea that you can put a test in and that'll change everything without doing anything else. I think a lot of the academic research into the impact watchback of assessment is a bit naive, to be honest, I find. And people tend to quote it without really thinking about the political realities where the decisions are made. So the political realities are that they see, policymakers see the assessment as the main driver. So one of our themes is not to say you can't do that, because they just won't listen. But what we would say is, you can do that. That's a great idea. What are you doing to train the teachers? What are you doing to update the materials that will be used in the classrooms? Will the classrooms, the structure of the classrooms, be acceptable to teach in this new way? So you just begin to put the other pieces of the puzzle together. And they're not dumb people, they do get it. But they will still insist on putting a test in to change the system.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We have a question in the chat. It's actually Liberato. And he says, personally, I'm typically positive about the adoption of technology into language teaching and assessment, provided we can make technology work for us humans and not the other way around. I think that's a point that Evelina made. Having said that, one of my students shared a concern in class I was teaching yesterday, which is, if learners start using AI to cheat on assignments and exams, will this cause teachers and examiners to return to more traditional ways of teaching and assessing, i.e. using ways to teach and assess that make sure learners and test takers can only do work that teachers can observe in real time with their own eyes to make sure learners and test takers are not using technology to cheat?
Very good question. And in fact, that's what's happening right now in the UK. I'm not sure about around the world, but there's a knee-jerk crisis right now about generative AI. And that is what some teachers are starting to do. So to give you an example, my oldest son is in final year of university. That's the year when you need to be doing assignments which encourage critical thinking, depth of investigation. One of his exams yesterday was, instead of take it, do it at home, spend a week on it, it was sit down in the classroom with the teacher observing you. So there is very much a shift to exactly what you're talking about. But I really think this is the transition crisis mode thinking. What we need to be doing is, we need to be, instead of denying the influence of this technology, we need to incorporate it in how we're conceptualizing assessment, in how we're conceptualizing learning. So if technology, if machine learning can write a 5-paragraph essay, let's take that 5-paragraph essay and work from that with the human involvement from our students. So it's going to push us to really conceptualize. And I think that's a big challenge. It's not going to be easy. I'm not naive about it. But there's an opportunity for us to embed what this technology can do, and for us to go that level higher of complexity, which is the human element that the technology cannot actually do. So if I can just comment, artificial intelligence is a very misleading name. The system is not intelligent. It is not even knowledgeable. It can only crunch through lots of information, but it has no intelligence and no knowledge. That's what human beings have. And that's where we can, step in and work with it instead of working against it.
Thanks,
One of the issues we have, though, is that it just announced today, for example, GPT-4 has now arrived on the scene, which is the next piece of the puzzle. And I spent a little bit of time today registering myself, putting myself on the waiting list so that I can get onto it as soon as possible. That's now, I've seen some examples of what it can do, and it has taken ChatGPT 3.5, from which GPT 3.5, from which ChatGPT comes, to an extra level. So now it's reduced these digital hallucinations. It's reduced its the capacity of it to actually drift off into very strange areas, which it tends to do. So this thing is changing. We know that GPT-5 is coming. So every time a new iteration of this comes, it can do more and more. So I agree completely with you that we have to look at this technology, and it's not even as simple anymore as what a human can do or what a machine can do. The machine is getting more and more human-like in what it can produce. So what we need to do is to learn how to live with it. I'm old enough to remember when calculators came out. We were banned from having calculators in class. Then we were banned from having calculators in exams. And then we went to university and we were told you have to get a calculator. We had no clue how to use the things, not properly.
Exactly. That's a brilliant example. It's a brilliant example. So yes, we just have to.
AI is the same. We need to learn it. We need to get to grips with it, so that by the time our learners are at the stage where they move on into the second level, even, or third level education, that they're familiar with it. It's a familiar technology, because we already know that GPT-4 actually is now supporting Microsoft Bing search engine. They've already introduced it before they made it public. So this stuff is here. It's not going away.
It is. And yet there's some human elements which the machine, at least now, cannot replicate. So for example, development of metacognition, such as, let's say, self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the most important thing all of us can have in terms of learning. So self-efficacy is the ability or the belief that we can achieve difficult tasks. That's something the machine cannot do, but the teacher can focus on that. So it's not going to be about information as much anymore. It's going to be about what can we as human beings, in terms of that understanding of learning, can bring into the process. Anyway, Barry, we shouldn't be hijacking.
I am going to stop you there, because you two are obviously very passionate about it, and we've got quite a few comments that I'd like to get through, if that's all right. But great, thank you. So Evelina, one for you. Fabio has said, please can you share some sources where we can find out more about all the information you shared in your PowerPoint, like Meta and ChatGPT and etc. And he said, thank you for your answer. And then we had a question, Barry. I always thought that the CFR was to be used as standards regarding competencies when designing courses or learning experiences. I heard that it should not be used as such earlier in this webinar. I would like to explore this idea a bit further. Would you mind elaborating a bit on this, Barry? I'm very excited about the conference.
Well, I'll be very fast. I could talk about it all bloody day long. That's one of
2
the
minutes,
problems
Barry. 2 minutes.
Even less, if possible. The CFR was never intended to be used as a standard. If you go back to the original document, and even more so in the companion volume, it very clearly states that it should be used as a reference document to help you to create materials, assessments, etc. It should not be used as it is. You have got to, and if you actually look at the CV, the new version of it, it actually, in that first initial chapter, it gives you an idea of how it can be used. One of the links I sent is a handbook, which was created by a bunch of organizations, including the British Council, and edited by a few of us. It was developed and delivered last year, I think it was. And that gives a very clear idea of how it can be used, how the CFR can be used. There's a handbook with very clear instructions as to how you'd start and some of the background to it. And I think without thinking about it as localized or localizable, then you're never going to really be able to create systematic assessment systems or learning systems. But we don't have the time to talk about it now, but if you can find me, who did the Diana?
At the conference.
Find me at the conference and I'll talk all day about it.
Can I just give a shout out to Yvonne? Thank you, Yvonne, for putting the link there to the CFR Journal Research and Practice. I think that's a really useful resource there as well. And I think, Nick, did you post something or add something? Thank you if you did. Yeah, Nick says they have a guide with localization of CFR on higher education. Thank you, Nick, for sharing that. We have one new message. Diana says, yes, she's going to find you at the conference. We have a few minutes. I'm just going to chuck in another question. This time I'm going to aim it at Gladys, if that's all right. Gladys, language assessment literacy is something that's very close to my heart. I'm very passionate about it, and there's a lot of research around assessment literacy and teachers, but there's a growing kind of body of research for language assessment literacy for policymakers, for teacher educators and things like that. If you were to design a language assessment literacy course for the education system, who would be your first stakeholder you would target outside teachers, and why?
Can you repeat the question? Who would be?
Yes, if you were going to develop a language assessment literacy course for the education system, apart from teachers, who would be your first stakeholder group to target, and why?
Policymakers.
Policymakers, tell us why.
I think we have been, at least in Brazil, we've been trying to work on language assessment literacy with teachers and future teachers. But I miss more work with people that are decision makers. I think politicians, people that are at the Ministry of Education, they you know, one of my dreams is that they should know more about that. Because sometimes we see things that are so, you know, when we study assessment and testing, and we see they do things that are completely, you know, divorced from what that should happen. So I think in this part we have a lot to go. We have a lot to do. So at least from, you know, the perspective we have in Brazil, I know in other Latin American countries maybe they have worked with other stakeholders. I know in other countries they have, like with admission officers and things like that. But if I had, you know, the power to decide, I would bring politicians and decision makers to take courses.
Okay, thank you. Evelina, I'm going to ask you the same question, but about digital literacy.
It's the same answer, really. I think we need to really work with the people who make the decisions that impact all the teachers and the learners and the test takers. And digital literacy, in a way, we shouldn't be talking about digital literacy. It is literacy. It is so much part of our life that we shouldn't single it out as a separate thing. It is part of literacy. So yeah, it's exactly the same.
The only thing I'm going to say about digital literacy, and not kind of separating it from literacy, I just think about the many parts of the world that actually don't have access to the technology to enable that literacy to happen. But hopefully one day we all will.
It's a good point, and I realize I was generalizing, but at the same time, I think that there are different degrees of complexity of literacy, of digital. And mobile phones is something that is quite widespread in a lot of the world, you know. Yeah. And so mobile phones is an example of using digital in your classroom. And so, yes, there's definitely more we should be doing for us to support teachers to understand how they can use digital, whether it's mobile phones or something much more sophisticated, how they can use digital so it adds value. I think that's okay. So actually, I'm going to change my answer, Mina.
Great.
It's the teachers. It's the teachers. That should be our first audience.
Okay. We have got 3 minutes left. Thank you for all the questions. Lovely presenters. Is there any last minute nuggets you would like to add before we wrap up? We do have a
No,
comment.
just that.
Gladys, you've reached the point the decision makers should know what they're imposing to teachers and students. Excellent. Sorry, Barry, you were going to say something.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've almost given up on decision makers because it's very difficult to get to them when they're driven by ideology. So what I think we need to do is to be looking at other ways of communicating to decision makers, and generally they will react when they think there are votes available. So what we need to do is to learn to speak the language of everyday people and move a little bit away from the one place that we're very happy communicating is with ourselves.
Yeah.
We need to learn how to communicate with regular people in different ways. And I think if we can get people who are actually involved in sensible discussions in the general public about what our ideas, then I think we can begin to change. Politicians, they don't even get out of bed in the morning if there's not a vote required.
True. And on that slightly cynical note, I'm going to bring our first pre-conference webinar to an end. Thank you, Evelina, thank you, Gladys, and thank you so much, Barry. But most of all, thank you to all our participants. Great comments, great questions. Please keep an eye on our website. The next webinar will be in April. And lots of thanks to everybody, and look forward to seeing you in Sao Paulo in May. Thank you, everybody.
Definitely.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Evelina. Thanks, Gladys.
Thank
See you
you.
soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Three
you,
of
Barry.
you.
Bye-bye, Evelina. Looking forward to meet you in São Paulo, both of you, the three of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.